Chapter 1. The Widow at the Window. The village of Blackthorn Hollow rested beneath a pale October sky, quiet as a sleeping cat. Thin fog curled lazily between crooked cottages, wrapping itself around stone walls and narrow lanes polished smooth by centuries of rain. Nothing in Blackthorn Hollow ever seemed to change. The church bell rang at the same hours. Shopkeepers swept their porches at dawn. Women traded gossip outside the bakery each afternoon. And every evening, precisely at 7, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore pulled apart the lace curtains of her front window and watched the village square. Children feared her. Adults pitied her. Nobody truly understood her. Mrs. Whitmore had lived alone in Ashcombe Cottage for nearly 20 years since the death of her husband, Captain Harold Whitmore, who had drowned under mysterious circumstances during a storm near the Cornish coast. Some said the tragedy had broken her mind. Others whispered she had never recovered from whatever secret existed between husband and wife before his death. But the most curious thing about Eleanor Whitmore was not her silence. It was her watching. Every evening she sat beside the window in a high-back chair, hands folded neatly in her lap, pale eyes fixed upon the square as though waiting for something only she could see. "Mark my words," old butcher Henry Pike often declared at the tavern, "that woman knows more about this village than the vicar himself." Nobody disagreed. On the evening the trouble began, as rain drummed softly upon the rooftops while wind rattled the black branches of the elm trees beside the churchyard. Most villagers hurried indoors before darkness settled fully over the square. Only Mr. Alfred Bell remained at his workshop. The clockmaker's shop stood opposite the bakery, narrow and tall, with dusty windows crowded by ticking clocks. Blackthorn Hollow depended upon Alfred Bell for every broken watch, every stubborn grandfather clock, every church mechanism that refused to chime correctly. Though nearly 60, he possessed steady hands and sharp blue eyes, magnified behind thick spectacles. At 10:30, Beatrice Marlowe passed his shop carrying a parcel beneath her coat. She paused briefly beneath the gas lamp. Inside the workshop, Alfred bent over a brass pocket watch while golden light flickered around him. Tiny gears glittered upon the desk beside scattered tools. Beatrice smiled faintly. "Working late again, Mr. Bell?" The old clockmaker glanced upward and chuckled. "Time refuses to repair itself, Miss Marlowe. Neither do villages, especially this one." She laughed politely before continuing through the square toward Rose Lane, where she rented 2 rooms above the pharmacist's shop. Beatrice Marlowe had arrived in Blackthorn Hollow only 8 months earlier, after accepting employment as companion to elderly Mrs. Davenhill, a wealthy invalid living near the moors. Though only 32, Beatrice possessed the calm patience of someone much older. She noticed details others ignored. People often found themselves revealing private matters to her without understanding why. Perhaps it was her gentle manner. Or perhaps it was the unsettling sharpness hidden behind her soft grey eyes. As she disappeared into the misty lane, another figure emerged briefly near the church gate. A tall man wearing a dark overcoat. He stood perfectly still beneath the shadows, watching the clockmaker's shop. From behind her lace curtains, Eleanor Whitmore noticed him immediately. Her fingers tightened slightly against the armchair. The man checked the square carefully before crossing toward the workshop door. For one strange moment the gaslight illuminated his face, though only partly, enough for recognition. Mrs. Whitmore inhaled sharply. "No," she whispered. But the man disappeared inside. The curtains trembled faintly beside her. Across the village, rain continued falling steadily while clocks ticked peacefully within Alfred Bell's workshop. Nobody heard raised voices. Nobody noticed danger creeping silently through Blackthorn Hollow, except Eleanor Whitmore. She watched the workshop windows for nearly 40 minutes. At exactly 11 minutes past midnight, the church bell gave a single strange clang, as though struck incorrectly. Then the workshop light vanished, a shadow crossed the square, and disappeared into the fog. Mrs. Whitmore remained frozen beside the curtains long after midnight passed. By morning, Alfred Bell was dead. The news spread through Blackthorn Hollow faster than wildfire across dry grass. Shop doors remained half open while villagers gathered anxiously outside the workshop. Policeman Gerald Hobb stood near the entrance, attempting unsuccessfully to control the growing crowd. "Step back now," he muttered repeatedly. Beatrice Marlowe arrived shortly after 9 carrying gloves and a dark umbrella. The fog had lifted, leaving the village damp and grey beneath weak sunlight. "What happened?" she asked quietly. The baker's wife leaned close. "Murder." The word travelled through the crowd like poison. Inside the workshop, Alfred Bell lay sprawled beside his desk. One hand remained stretched toward the floor, while shattered clock parts glittered around him. His spectacles had fallen nearby, but the strangest detail was the door, locked from inside. Policeman Hobbs scratched nervously at his beard. Windows bolted, chimney too narrow, no sign anybody entered or left. "A locked room mystery?" murmured Beatrice softly. Dr. Finch closed his medical bag with a grim expression. Blow to the head, sometime near midnight. The clock still ticked. Hundreds of tiny mechanical heartbeats filling the room. Tick, tick, tick. Beatrice slowly surveyed the workshop. Her gaze settled upon a brass mantel clock overturned beside the victim's chair. The glass face had cracked. Its hands remained frozen. 11:11. Interesting. Very interesting. "Did anyone see anything unusual last night?" she asked. Nobody answered immediately. Then a quiet voice emerged from the doorway. "I did." The villagers turned sharply. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore stood there wearing black gloves and an old wool coat. The crowd shifted uneasily as she stepped inside. Her pale eyes moved toward the dead clockmaker. "I saw someone leave this shop after midnight." Murmurs spread instantly. Policeman Hobb frowned. "At what hour exactly?" 11 minutes past midnight." "How can you be certain?" "Because, Mrs. Whitmore replied calmly. The church bell rang incorrectly at the same moment. Silence settled heavily across the workshop. Beatrice studied the old widow carefully. "You recognize the person?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Eleanor Whitmore's face. "No," she said slowly. But Beatrice knew at once she was lying. Outside, wind stirred the village square, while church bells echoed faintly through Blackthorn Hollow. And behind the widow's lace curtains, the first secret had already begun to unravel. Chapter 2. 11 minutes. Past midnight. Morning rain lingered over Blackthorn Hollow like a stubborn ghost. Water dripped steadily from rooftops while muddy footprints spread across the village square where curious neighbours still gathered in uneasy clusters. Alfred Bell's workshop remained sealed behind police tape. Though the clocks inside continued ticking faintly, creating an unnerving sound whenever the wind shifted. Blackthorn Hollow had not seen a murder in nearly 40 years, and certainly not one involving locked doors. Inside the Rose and Crown Tavern, whispers travelled from table to table faster than the serving girl carrying tea. "They say his skull was cracked clean open." No sign of robbery neither. Perhaps he surprised a burglar. Impossible. Alfred always locked up before dark. But the widow saw someone. At the mention of Mrs. Whitmore, voices lowered automatically. Fear had begun growing around her once again. Beatrice Marlowe sat quietly near the tavern window, stirring untouched tea while listening carefully to every conversation around her. Villagers often revealed truths accidentally. People spoke freely when they believed nobody important was paying attention. And Blackthorn Hollow was full of careless talkers. The tavern door opened sharply, admitting a gust of cold wind and Dr. Finch, whose damp coat smelled faintly of tobacco and rain. "Miss Marlowe," he greeted, removing gloves. "You've heard the latest?" "I suspect everybody has." The doctor lowered himself heavily into the opposite chair. The constable discovered something rather curious. Beatrice leaned forward slightly. "Oh?" The workshop key was missing. "That is curious, especially since the door was locked from inside." For several moments only the crackling fireplace filled the silence between them. Dr. Finch rubbed tired eyes. "I dislike this business immensely. Alfred Bell wasn't the sort to make enemies." "No," said Beatrice softly. "But quiet men often keep dangerous secrets." The doctor gave her a strange look. "You sound remarkably certain." "I merely observe patterns." Before he could respond, another figure entered the tavern. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore. Conversations died instantly. The old widow moved carefully across the room, carrying a folded umbrella and wearing the same dark clothing she always wore. She acknowledged nobody directly, yet seemed perfectly aware of every eye following her movements. She approached Beatrice's table. "May I sit?" "Of course." Dr. Finch shifted awkwardly before muttering something about patience and escaping gratefully toward the door. Mrs. Whitmore watched him leave. "Cowardly little man." "He's frightened," said Beatrice, "as they all are." The tavern girl delivered tea with visibly trembling hands before hurrying away. Mrs. Whitmore sighed faintly. Young people today enjoy fear far too much. Beatrice studied her carefully. Up close, Eleanor Whitmore appeared older than yesterday. Deep shadows rested beneath her pale eyes, and her thin hands shook almost invisibly while lifting the teacup. "You recognized the man outside the workshop," Beatrice said quietly. The widow's gaze hardened immediately. "I told the constable otherwise." "Yes, you lied." For a long moment neither woman spoke. Rain tapped softly against the tavern windows. Finally Mrs. Whitmore whispered, "Some truths are dangerous once spoken aloud." "To whom?" "To everyone." Beatrice waited patiently. At last the widow leaned closer. "The man I saw wore Harold's coat." Beatrice blinked once. "Your husband's?" Mrs. Whitmore nodded slowly. "It was dark, of course. Yet I know that coat. Brown wool. Velvet collar. Torn cuff near the wrist." Her voice weakened slightly. "I buried it 20 years ago." A strange chill moved through Beatrice despite the warmth of the fire. Surely somebody else could own a similar coat. Not with Harold's initials stitched inside. "You saw the initials?" "No," Eleanor admitted quietly. "But I know what I saw." Beatrice considered this carefully. Captain Harold Whitmore had died decades earlier. Entire villages did not rise from graves. "Did Alfred Bell know your husband?" she asked. The widow's expression changed instantly. A flicker of old pain crossed her face. "Yes." "Were they friends?" "No." Outside, church bells rang 11 o'clock through the damp morning air. Mrs. Whitmore finished her tea with trembling hands before standing abruptly. "Miss Marlowe," she said quietly, "there are things buried in this village that ought never be disturbed. Murders rarely stay buried." The widow hesitated near the doorway. "That is exactly what frightens me." Then she disappeared into the rain. By afternoon, Beatrice found herself standing once again inside Alfred Bell's workshop beside Constable Gerald Hobb, who looked exhausted already. "I still don't understand why they sent no inspector from London," he complained while unlocking a cabinet drawer. "A murder's bad enough. A locked-room murder makes fools of village policemen." Beatrice smiled faintly. "You're managing better than you think." "Not according to the villagers." He pointed toward the overturned clock. "Every clock stopped at 11 minutes past midnight except that one." "Except?" "The wall clock above the door." Hobb frowned. "That one kept running." Interesting again, thought Beatrice. Very interesting indeed. She slowly examined the workshop more carefully than before. Brass instruments covered shelves beside tiny labelled drawers filled with springs and gears. The room smelled pleasantly of machine oil and dust. Nothing appeared disturbed except the desk area surrounding the body. "Did Alfred Bell receive visitors often?" she asked. "Rarely, kept mostly to himself." "Family?" "No wife, no children." Hobb paused. "Though there was a nephew once." "What happened to him?" "Nobody knows exactly. Left the village years ago after some disagreement." Beatrice's eyes drifted toward the back wall where framed photographs hung unevenly above a cabinet. One photograph caught her attention immediately. 3 young men standing beside a fishing boat. Captain Harold Whitmore, Alfred Bell, and a third man Beatrice did not recognize. "All friends once?" she asked. Constable Hobb glanced toward the picture. "So they say, but not later." "No." The constable lowered his voice. "There was an accident at sea. Harold Whitmore drowned. Afterwards the friendship ended." "Why?" "Village gossip mostly. Some blamed Bell for surviving." Beatrice approached the photograph slowly. The unknown third man smiled broadly between the others. Yet somebody had scratched his face repeatedly with something sharp, not recently, long ago. "Who is he?" she asked. Constable Hobb squinted. "Thomas Mercer, I think. Schoolmaster's son." "And where is Mr. Mercer now?" The constable gave a humourless laugh. "Dead." A silence settled over the workshop. "How did he die?" "Fell beneath a train 22 years ago." Beatrice stared thoughtfully at the damaged photograph. 3 friends, 2 dead, 1 murdered, and a widow watching from behind curtains. Outside the workshop window, movement caught her eye suddenly. A figure stood briefly across the square beside the bakery. Tall, dark overcoat, watching the shop. Before Beatrice could react, the figure vanished into the crowd. Constable Hobb noticed nothing. But Beatrice felt certain of one thing now. Someone in Blackthorn Hollow was terrified of the past returning, and perhaps for very good reason. That evening, Mrs. Whitmore sat once more behind her lace curtains, while darkness swallowed the square outside Ashcombe Cottage. For the first time in 20 years, she unlocked a drawer hidden beneath her sewing table. Inside rested an old leather journal and a brass key stained dark with age. Her fingers trembled violently as she opened the journal to the final page. One sentence stared back at her. "If anything happens to me, Eleanor must never trust Alfred Bell. The handwriting belonged to her dead husband." Chapter 3. The Clockmaker's Silent Room. The following morning arrived beneath heavy clouds that pressed low over Blackthorn Hollow like damp wool. Smoke curled sluggishly from cottage chimneys, and the village square carried the uncomfortable stillness that often follows tragedy. Even the bakery opened late. People were watching one another now. Suspicion had entered Blackthorn Hollow quietly, slipping beneath doors and settling beside breakfast tables. Beatrice Marlowe noticed it immediately. The grocer avoided eye contact with the butcher. The postmaster lowered his voice whenever Constable Hobb approached. Curtains shifted everywhere she walked. Entire conversations stopped the moment she appeared. Murder transformed ordinary villages into theatres, and everyone became actors. Beatrice crossed the square shortly after 10, carrying a notebook beneath her arm. Her destination was Alfred Bell's funeral cottage, where the clockmaker's belongings had been temporarily catalogued before examination by county officials. Constable Hobb greeted her with visible relief. "Thank heavens you've come," he muttered. "You appear troubled. I found something odd during the inventory. In a murder investigation, that is usually promising." The constable led her into a narrow storage room beside the workshop. Shelves overflowed with dismantled clocks, tools, and dusty wooden boxes smelling faintly of cedar. Upon a table rested several personal items belonging to Alfred Bell: a silver watch, spectacles, letters tied carefully with ribbon, and a revolver. Beatrice raised an eyebrow. Did Bell own firearms? Apparently. Hobb scratched his neck nervously. But that isn't the strange part. He pointed toward the revolver chamber, fully loaded, untouched. "Meaning Alfred Bell expected danger," Beatrice said softly, "yet never reached for protection." "Exactly." She lifted the weapon carefully with gloved fingers. The metal felt cold despite the warm room. "If he trusted the visitor," she murmured, "he would have lowered his guard." Constable Hobb nodded slowly. "That was my thinking, too." Beatrice returned the revolver gently before examining the letters. Most were ordinary business matters: repairs, payments, supply orders from London. But one envelope immediately caught her attention. No address, no stamp. Only a single word written across the front: "Remember." Inside rested a folded sheet containing one sentence: "The sea gives back what men attempt to bury." No signature, no date. Yet the handwriting appeared hurried and angry. "When was this delivered?" Beatrice asked. 3 days before the murder. And Bell told nobody? He burned most private correspondence." Hobb frowned. "Odd thing is, this letter survived untouched." "Because he feared it," thought Beatrice. Someone had reopened an old wound. She glanced again toward the photograph of the 3 young men removed earlier from the workshop wall. Harold Whitmore, Alfred Bell, and Thomas Mercer smiled forever from another lifetime, frozen before whatever destroyed their friendship. 3 names circling the mystery repeatedly, too repeatedly to ignore. "Constable," she asked quietly, "did anyone investigate Captain Whitmore's drowning properly?" Hobb hesitated. "There was an inquiry, and the death was ruled accidental. But—" The constable sighed heavily. "Villages remember rumours longer than facts." "What rumours?" "That Whitmore argued with Bell shortly before the storm." Hobb lowered his voice instinctively. "And some believed Thomas Mercer knew why." Beatrice folded the anonymous letter carefully. "Until he died beneath a train." Yes. Convenient deaths, she thought silently. Far too convenient. A sudden knock interrupted them. Dr. Finch entered, carrying mud upon his boots and irritation upon his face. "You've another problem," he announced grimly. Constable Hobbs straightened immediately. "What now?" "The church caretaker discovered someone inside the graveyard at dawn." "Doing what?" "Digging." Silence filled the storage room. Beatrice exchanged a sharp glance with the constable. "Which grave?" she asked quietly. Dr. Finch swallowed. "Captain Harold Whitmore's." 20 minutes later, the three stood beneath grey skies inside Blackthorn churchyard, where cold wind hissed through yew trees surrounding ancient graves. Fresh mud scattered across the ground beside Harold Whitmore's headstone. Someone had indeed attempted digging there, not deeply, but deliberately. Constable Hobb crouched beside disturbed earth with growing unease. "No coffin exposed," he muttered. "Looks interrupted." Beatrice studied the area carefully. "Or frightened away." Nearby, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore stood perfectly motionless beneath a black umbrella. Her face had become almost colourless. "You knew already," Beatrice observed gently. The widow did not deny it. "I came before sunrise," she whispered. "The grave was disturbed then." "Why say nothing?" Mrs. Whitmore's eyes remained fixed upon the muddy earth. "Because I knew this would happen eventually." Constable Hobb looked utterly bewildered. "Madam, if there's something you know—" "There are many things I know, Constable." Her voice sharpened suddenly. "That does not mean you are prepared to hear them." The church bell rang once overhead. Its hollow sound echoed across the graves. Beatrice moved closer to the widow. "You believe someone searches for evidence connected to your husband?" "No." Eleanor's voice trembled faintly. "I believe someone fears what may already exist." Before Beatrice could respond, movement near the church gate caught her attention. A man stood there briefly watching them. Tall, dark overcoat, velvet collar, the same figure again. Beatrice stepped forward immediately. "Sir!" The man turned sharply and disappeared behind the stone wall. Constable Hobb rushed after him, boots slipping through wet grass, but returned minutes later breathless and furious. "Gone." Mrs. Whitmore closed her eyes briefly. "He's back," she whispered. That evening, Beatrice sat inside her rented room above the pharmacy, while rain hammered the windows fiercely enough to rattle the glass. A coal fire glowed beside her chair, though it failed to warm the strange chill resting upon her thoughts. She reviewed every detail carefully: a murdered clockmaker, a locked workshop, a missing key, an anonymous threat, a disturbed grave, and a widow terrified of the past. The pieces connected somehow, but not correctly. A soft knock interrupted her concentration. When she opened the door, she found the village postmaster standing nervously in the hallway holding a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "For you, Miss Marlowe. No sender?" He shook his head quickly. "Left anonymously downstairs." After he departed, Beatrice carried the parcel carefully to her desk. Inside rested an old newspaper clipping dated 22 years earlier. Local schoolmaster's son killed in train accident. Below the headline appeared a small photograph of Thomas Mercer, and beneath the clipping someone had written in fresh ink, "Thomas Mercer never saw the train." Beatrice stared at the sentence while wind howled outside like distant voices. A murder concealed as accident, another concealed as drowning. And now Alfred Bell dead before speaking openly. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Suddenly footsteps creaked softly in the hallway beyond her room, then stopped. Beatrice remained perfectly still. Another sound followed. Breathing. Someone stood outside her door. Slowly, silently, Beatrice extinguished the lamp beside her chair. Darkness swallowed the room instantly. The breathing continued. Then came 3 soft scratches against the wood. Not knocking. Warning. Moments later, hurried footsteps retreated down the stairs below. Beatrice waited several minutes before relighting the lamp and opening the door cautiously. The hallway stood empty, but resting upon the floorboards outside her room was a single brass clock key. Fresh mud clung to it, and engraved faintly upon the handle were the letters. Chapter 4. Letters. Beneath the floorboards. The storm passed during the night, leaving Blackthorn Hollow washed clean beneath pale morning sunlight. Rainwater glittered along cobbled lanes, while chimney smoke drifted lazily upward into the cold spring air. Yet despite the brighter weather, unease lingered heavily across the village. Doors locked earlier now, Neighbours studied unfamiliar footsteps, and every ticking clock seemed louder than before. Beatrice Marlowe had slept little. The brass key discovered outside her room remained wrapped carefully inside a handkerchief upon her desk. She had examined it repeatedly before dawn. H.W. Harold Whitmore. The initials were unmistakable. But why would someone leave the key outside her door instead of simply speaking to her directly? And how had it become stained with fresh graveyard mud? Questions multiplied faster than answers. At 9 o'clock precisely, Beatrice crossed the square toward Ashcombe Cottage. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore had requested her presence by handwritten note delivered shortly after sunrise. The old cottage stood partly hidden behind climbing ivy and skeletal rose bushes stripped bare by autumn winds. Its windows were covered, as always, by pale lace curtains moving faintly in the morning breeze. Mrs. Whitmore opened the door before Beatrice could knock. "You came quickly. You sounded frightened." "I am." Inside, the cottage smelled faintly of lavender, old books and extinguished coal fires. Heavy furniture crowded the sitting room while framed photographs lined the mantelpiece beside silver candle holders tarnished by time. Mrs. Whitmore locked the door carefully behind them. Then she led Beatrice toward the staircase. "Come upstairs," she whispered. The bedroom at the top floor faced directly toward the village square. Here stood the famous window from which Eleanor Whitmore had observed Blackthorn Hollow for 20 years. Beatrice noticed immediately how perfectly the view aligned with Alfred Bell's workshop. "You watched the entire village from here," she murmured. "No," Eleanor corrected softly. "Only the people I feared." Without another word, the widow crossed toward an old wardrobe and knelt slowly beside it. Her thin fingers reached beneath loose floorboards hidden under the carpet edge. A moment later she withdrew a bundle of yellowed letters tied carefully with black ribbon. Beatrice's pulse quickened slightly. "You hid these?" "For 20 years. "Why?" "Because Harold begged me never to show them unless something happened to him." The widow's voice trembled as she handed over the letters. Most were written by Captain Harold Whitmore during his final months alive. The handwriting appeared neat at first, but gradually grew hurried and uneven across later pages. Beatrice unfolded one carefully. "If Bell discovers what Mercer told me, none of us shall survive the winter." Another letter read, "Thomas believes the wreck was no accident. God help us if he is correct." Beatrice looked up sharply. "Wreck?" Mrs. Whitmore nodded weakly. "There was another boat besides Harold's. Tell me everything." The widow lowered herself heavily into a chair beside the window. 22 years ago, Harold, Alfred Bell, and Thomas Mercer sailed together along the Cornish coast searching for salvage after a storm. A merchant vessel had crashed against the cliffs carrying expensive cargo. "Jewellery?" Mrs. Whitmore stared. "How did you know?" "Vanished jewellery was mentioned after Bell's death." The widow folded trembling hands. "The ship carried diamonds belonging to a Belgian collector fleeing Europe before the war. Officially, the cargo disappeared beneath the sea. But unofficially, Harold believed someone recovered part of it secretly." Silence filled the bedroom except for distant church bells drifting through the village. "And Thomas Mercer discovered the truth?" Beatrice asked quietly. "Yes." "What exactly?" Mrs. Whitmore's eyes shifted toward the window instinctively, as though afraid of being overheard even now. "He discovered the diamonds never sank." A chill crept through Beatrice despite the sunlight warming the room. "Who took them?" "I don't know." Eleanor's voice weakened. "But after that voyage, the three men changed completely. Harold became nervous. Thomas drank heavily. Alfred Bell stopped speaking to either of them. And then, Thomas died beneath the train tracks, and your husband drowned." Mrs. Whitmore closed her eyes painfully. He was terrified before the storm. Absolutely terrified. Beatrice reached carefully for another letter within the bundle. This one appeared unfinished. "If anything happens, search beneath." The sentence ended abruptly. "Beneath what?" Beatrice whispered. "I never knew." Suddenly a loud knock echoed downstairs. Both women froze instantly. Another knock followed. Constable Hobbs' voice called upward. "Mrs. Whitmore? Miss Marlowe?" Relief crossed Eleanor's face momentarily, but Beatrice noticed something else beneath it. Disappointment. Downstairs, Constable Hobb removed his cap nervously, while glancing repeatedly toward the curtained windows. "There's been another incident," he announced. "What sort of incident?" asked Beatrice. "The Bell workshop was searched overnight." Mrs. Whitmore inhaled sharply. "Anything taken?" That's the odd part, Hob frowned. Nothing valuable missing, but someone ripped apart the floorboards. Beatrice exchanged a quick glance with Eleanor. Beneath. The unfinished sentence returned immediately to her thoughts. Search beneath. Without delay, they crossed the square together toward the workshop. Villagers gathered nearby once more, whispering anxiously as Constable Hob unlocked the damaged door. Inside, chaos greeted them. Drawers overturned, shelves emptied, clock parts scattered across the floor like metallic bones, and near Alfred Bell's desk, several floorboards had indeed been pried open violently. Whoever searched the workshop had been desperate. Beatrice crouched beside the damaged boards thoughtfully. What lies beneath here? Nothing now, Hob muttered. Only dirt. But something glimmered faintly inside the narrow opening. Beatrice reached carefully downward. Her fingers closed around cold metal. A necklace emerged slowly from the darkness, and diamonds flashed brilliantly beneath the workshop light. Even Constable Hob stared speechlessly. My God. The necklace was exquisite. Old European craftsmanship, impossibly expensive for any villager in Blackthorn Hollow to possess. Mrs. Whitmore turned pale as paper. The salvage cargo, she whispered. Beatrice examined the necklace closely. One clasp appeared broken recently, as though torn away during struggle, perhaps during murder. Constable Hobbs swallowed hard. Sir Alfred Bell hid the diamonds all these years. Perhaps only part of them, said Beatrice quietly, and someone killed him searching for the rest. A dreadful silence settled over the ruined workshop. Then Beatrice noticed something else inside the opened floor cavity. More paper. She withdrew another folded letter hidden beneath the boards. Unlike Harold Whitmore's letters, this handwriting belonged to Alfred Bell himself. The message contained only one sentence. Mercer was murdered because he saw the lantern signal from the cliffs. Every face in the room changed instantly. A signal, a shipwreck, smuggled diamonds, and murder stretching backward across 2 decades. Constable Hob looked overwhelmed. This entire village is built atop lies. No, Beatrice corrected softly while folding the letter carefully, only atop secrets. Outside the workshop, clouds drifted slowly across the afternoon sky, while villagers continued whispering fearfully around the square. And from behind an upstairs window across the road, unseen eyes watched them all through parted lace curtains once again. Chapter 5. The Woman Who Never Travelled by Thursday Evening. Blackthorn Hollow no longer resembled the peaceful village Beatrice Marlowe had first encountered months earlier. Fear had changed its rhythm completely. Curtains closed before sunset. Strangers were noticed immediately. Even the church choir practiced in hushed voices, as though loud music might disturb something dangerous lurking beneath the surface of ordinary life. And everywhere, people whispered about the diamonds. Constable Hob had attempted secrecy after discovering the jewelled necklace hidden beneath Alfred Bell's workshop floorboards, but villagers possessed their own methods of communication. News travelled invisibly through bakeries, taverns, barbershops, and garden fences. By nightfall, everyone knew. The murdered clockmaker had hidden stolen jewels for 20 years, which meant someone in Blackthorn Hollow had once committed a far greater crime than murder. Beatrice spent most of the morning reviewing Harold Whitmore's letters beside the fire in her rented room. Several details continued troubling her deeply. The lantern signal from the cliffs, Thomas Mercer's sudden death beneath the train, and one peculiar fact repeatedly mentioned throughout the letters: Eleanor must never leave the village. At first, the sentence seemed meaningless, yet Harold Whitmore wrote it 4 separate times. Never leave Blackthorn Hollow, never travel, never trust Bell. Strange instructions for a husband fearing ordinary danger. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Davenhill's maid entered carrying tea in an envelope. A visitor downstairs. Miss. Who? She refused giving her name. Beatrice descended cautiously into the pharmacy entrance hall below. There she found a woman standing beside the doorway, wearing a dark green travelling coat damp with road dust. Though perhaps 50 years old, she carried herself with striking confidence. I am searching for Miss Marlowe, the woman said. You found her. The stranger removed leather gloves carefully. My name is Lydia Mercer. Beatrice felt immediate stillness inside her chest. Mercer. Thomas Mercer's sister. Yes. Interesting, thought Beatrice. Very interesting indeed. They moved into the pharmacy sitting room where privacy could be assured. Lydia Mercer accepted tea politely, yet wasted no time with formalities. "I arrived from London this morning after hearing about Alfred Bell's death. You remained in contact with him?" "Certainly not." Her voice hardened sharply. "I came because Bell deserved hanging 20 years ago." Beatrice studied the woman carefully. Lydia Mercer possessed intelligent dark eyes and an expression suggesting long-contained anger rather than grief. "You believe Bell murdered your brother?" "I know he did. That is a serious accusation." "It was serious when Thomas died." Rain began tapping lightly against the windows while Lydia removed several folded papers from her handbag. "My brother wrote these shortly before his death." The letters appeared worn from repeated reading. One sentence immediately caught Beatrice's attention. "If anything happens, Bell must not keep the stones. Again the stones. Again fear. Again Alfred Bell." "What exactly did Thomas discover?" Beatrice asked quietly. Lydia hesitated before answering. "The shipwreck was deliberate." Silence filled the room instantly. "Deliberate?" "Yes." Lydia leaned forward. "Thomas saw lanterns flashing from the cliffs during the storm. The merchant ship changed course directly toward the rocks afterward." "A false signal?" "Exactly." Beatrice's thoughts raced quickly. Smugglers had used false lanterns for centuries along dangerous coasts, tricking ships into wrecking against hidden reefs so cargo could be stolen afterward. But who in Blackthorn Hollow would organise such a crime? And Bell participated? "My brother believed Bell helped recover the diamonds afterward." Lydia's eyes darkened. "But someone else planned the wreck itself." Before Beatrice could respond, another troubling realisation emerged suddenly. "You said you came from London this morning." "Yes." "How did you learn about Bell's death so quickly?" Lydia paused only briefly. "A telegram." "From whom?" This time the hesitation lasted longer. "An old friend." Beatrice noticed it immediately. The woman was lying. Not completely, perhaps, but enough. Meanwhile, across the village square, Eleanor Whitmore sat behind her lace curtains, watching the rain fall steadily over Blackthorn Hollow. Her hands trembled violently, because she recognised Lydia Mercer, and Lydia Mercer was never supposed to return. The old widow rose abruptly from her chair and crossed toward the locked cabinet hidden beneath the staircase. From inside she removed a faded railway ticket dated 20 years earlier, unused, London to Edinburgh. Purchased for Eleanor Whitmore. The ticket Harold had forbidden her to use. Never leave Blackthorn Hollow. The memory returned painfully clear now. Harold standing beside the fireplace on the final night before his death, soaked by sea rain and shaking with terror. "If I die," he had whispered, "promise me you'll stay here." "You believe they'll come after me?" "They already have." "And the police?" Harold laughed bitterly. "You still think this concerns diamonds?" That sentence had haunted Eleanor for 2 decades, because he never explained further. A sudden movement outside the window startled her back to the present. Someone stood near the churchyard gate, watching Ashcombe Cottage. Tall figure, dark overcoat, velvet collar. The man lifted one gloved hand slowly toward the window, then tapped his wrist twice. 11 minutes past midnight. Eleanor gasped softly and stepped backward from the curtains. No, impossible. Yet terror flooded her face completely for the first time. Across the village, Beatrice walked Lydia Mercer toward the tavern after their conversation ended. Evening fog had begun curling once more through the narrow lanes, while church bells rang 6 o'clock softly overhead. "You intend remaining in Blackthorn Hollow?" Beatrice asked. "For now." "Despite the danger?" Lydia gave a cold smile. "My brother lived in fear before he died. I do not intend repeating his mistake." As they approached the square, Constable Hobb hurried toward them looking unusually pale. "Miss Marlowe," he said breathlessly, "there's been another development." "What happened?" "The grave." Beatrice's expression sharpened immediately. "Harold Whitmore's?" "Yes." Hobb swallowed nervously. Someone returned again. Within minutes they reached the churchyard where several villagers gathered anxiously beneath lantern light. Rain-soaked mud surrounded Captain Whitmore's grave once more. But this time the digging had gone deeper, much deeper. The coffin lid was visible, broken open. Mrs. Whitmore stood nearby gripping the church gate for support while Dr. Finch attempted calming her unsuccessfully. Constable Hobb lowered his voice. "There's something worse." He pointed downward. The coffin inside the grave stood empty. For several seconds nobody spoke. Even the wind seemed to stop. Lydia Mercer stared in disbelief. "That's impossible." Dr. Finch removed spectacles shakily. "The burial records are correct. Harold Whitmore was placed here 20 years ago." "But there's no body," whispered Hobb. Mrs. Whitmore suddenly closed her eyes as though surrendering to exhaustion at last. "I told him," she murmured weakly. "Told who?" asked Beatrice quickly. But Eleanor Whitmore collapsed before answering. Chaos erupted immediately. Villagers shouted. Dr. Finch knelt beside the unconscious widow, while Constable Hobb attempted clearing the crowd away from the open grave. Beatrice alone remained perfectly still beside the empty coffin, thinking. Harold Whitmore feared Belle. Thomas Mercer discovered the truth. A shipwreck had been arranged deliberately, and now the dead captain's grave contained no body at all. Only one conclusion remained possible. Someone buried in Blackthorn Hollow 20 years earlier had never truly died, and somewhere nearby, that person might still be alive. Chapter 6. Shadows Across Blackthorn Square. The discovery of the empty coffin shattered Blackthorn Hollow completely. By dawn, every villager knew. Captain Harold Whitmore's grave contained no body. Fear spread faster than reason after that. Women crossed themselves while speaking his name. Children refused walking near the churchyard. Some claimed they had seen a man wandering the square after midnight, wearing an old naval coat darkened by rain. Others swore the dead had returned. Beatrice Marlowe believed neither ghosts nor village superstitions, but she did believe someone had spent 20 years constructing a very careful lie. And that lie was finally collapsing. Rain clouds drifted low across the morning sky as Beatrice visited Ashcombe Cottage shortly after breakfast. Constable Hobb stood outside the gate looking exhausted beyond measure. "How is Mrs. Whitmore?" she asked. "Awake," he answered quietly, though Dr. Finch says shock has weakened her badly. "Has she spoken?" "Only one sentence repeatedly." "What sentence?" The constable hesitated. He should have stayed buried. Inside the cottage, silence pressed heavily against the walls. Curtains remained half-drawn despite daylight, filling the rooms with grey shadows and stale air. Mrs. Whitmore sat near the fireplace wrapped in blankets. She looked impossibly fragile now, like thin paper left too long in sunlight. Yet her eyes remained sharp. "You came," she whispered. "I need the truth, Mrs. Whitmore." The widow gave a faint, bitter smile. "So does everyone else." Beatrice pulled a chair beside her. "Was your husband alive after the shipwreck?" For several moments Eleanor Whitmore stared silently into the fire. Then she nodded once. "Yes." Even hearing the confirmation aloud felt strange. "You saw him afterward?" 3 nights later. Constable Hobb inhaled sharply behind them. Mrs. Whitmore continued speaking quietly, almost mechanically, as though repeating memories she had buried for years. He arrived at the cottage soaked by rain, terrified, injured along his shoulder. Her trembling fingers tightened around the blanket. Harold said Thomas Mercer had discovered something aboard the wrecked ship. The diamonds? No. Eleanor looked directly at Beatrice. Names. A cold silence settled through the room. "What names?" asked Beatrice softly. "Important men. Men connected to Parliament. Customs officers. Shipping companies." Eleanor swallowed weakly. "The wreck wasn't ordinary smuggling. It was organised." Beatrice felt the pieces shifting again. Not simple theft. Conspiracy. And Alfred Bell. Harold trusted him once. Her voice cracked faintly. But afterward, he feared him. Why? Because Bell wanted the diamonds sold quietly, while Harold wanted evidence delivered to authorities. Constable Hobb rubbed tired eyes. "So Bell murdered him?" "No." The answer came instantly. Too instantly. Beatrice noticed it immediately. "You're protecting someone," she said quietly. Mrs. Whitmore closed her eyes. "Perhaps I protected the wrong person." Outside, church bells echoed across the square while wind rattled branches against the cottage roof. Finally Eleanor whispered, "Harold planned leaving England? With the evidence?" "Yes. But he never left." "No. Why not?" The widow's pale face hardened unexpectedly. "Because somebody betrayed him." At that exact moment, loud shouting erupted outside. Constable Hobb rushed toward the window. "What now?" A boy from the bakery sprinted across the square breathlessly. "There's been another death." The abandoned manor house stood beyond the northern edge of Blackthorn Hollow, overlooking empty moorland and tangled woods. Hollow Manor had belonged to the Pembroke family before the war, though nobody lived there now except caretakers during occasional summers. By the time Beatrice arrived with Constable Hobb, villagers already crowded the gates despite steady rain beginning once more. Dr. Finch emerged from the manor entrance, pale as chalk. "You'd better come inside." The body lay inside the old music room, Lydia Mercer. She rested beside a shattered gramophone cabinet, one hand still clutching torn fabric from someone's coat. Her expression remained frozen in shock rather than fear. Dr. Finch spoke grimly. "Strangled sometime during the night." Constable Hobb cursed quietly beneath his breath. Beatrice slowly examined the room. Furniture draped in white sheets resembled ghosts standing silently around the corpse. Dust covered nearly everything except muddy footprints leading toward the rear staircase. 2 distinct sets, one smaller, one belonging to a tall man. "Who found her?" asked Beatrice. "The caretaker," replied Hobb. "Said Miss Mercer arrived yesterday evening asking questions about old shipping records stored here." "Interesting. Very interesting." Beatrice knelt beside Lydia carefully. The dead woman's fingers still gripped a piece of brown wool fabric, velvet collar. Her pulse quickened slightly. The mysterious overcoat again. But something else drew her attention immediately. Beneath Lydia's body rested folded paper partially hidden under her arm. Beatrice retrieved it carefully. A map, old and yellowed with age. Coastal markings circled in red ink near the Cornish cliffs, where Harold Whitmore's ship supposedly wrecked 20 years earlier, and beside one marked location appeared 3 initials, HWABTM. "Good Lord," muttered Constable Hobb softly. Dr. Finch pointed toward the fireplace suddenly. "There's more." Inside, the ashes rested burned papers not entirely destroyed. Beatrice used fireplace tongs carefully, lifting blackened fragments one by one. Most words were unreadable, except for a single surviving line. The signal lantern was placed by. The sentence ended there. Destroyed deliberately. Someone had murdered Lydia Mercer before she could expose the truth, and someone else had attempted burning the evidence afterward. Beatrice's gaze drifted slowly across the silent room, then stopped. A grandfather clock stood against the far wall, its hands frozen. 11:11. Again. Back in Blackthorn Hollow, darkness settled early beneath thick storm clouds. Rain hammered windows while villagers locked doors firmly against the growing terror infecting the village. Inside Ashcombe Cottage, Eleanor Whitmore sat alone beside the fire listening to the storm. She knew the killings would continue now, because Lydia Mercer had returned too close to the truth. A soft knock echoed at the front door. Eleanor froze instantly. Another knock followed, slow, measured. The widow rose shakily and approached the hallway. "Who is it?" For several seconds only rain answered. Then a man's voice came softly through the door. "Eleanor!" Her blood turned cold. The voice was older now, rougher, yet unmistakable. "No," she whispered. "Please open the door." The widow's hands trembled violently. Outside, hidden by darkness and rain, a tall figure waited beneath the porch lantern, wearing a brown overcoat with a velvet collar. And for the first time in 20 years, Eleanor Whitmore believed her dead husband had finally come home. Chapter 7. The second death at Hollow Manor. Wind roared across Blackthorn Hollow through most of the night, rattling windows hard enough to wake nearly every household in the village. Rain lashed against rooftops while chimney smoke twisted wildly into darkness. Yet within Ashcombe Cottage, Eleanor Whitmore heard only the voice beyond her door. Eleanor. Older, weaker, but horribly familiar. For one suspended moment, 20 years vanished entirely. She was no longer an old widow trembling beside dying firelight. She was once again a frightened young wife waiting for Harold Whitmore to return from the sea. Another knock came softly. "Please." Eleanor's hand reached toward the lock before reason returned sharply enough to stop her. Dead men did not stand upon porches during storms, unless they had never truly died. "You cannot be Harold," she whispered through the wood. A pause followed. Then the voice answered quietly, "No, but I knew him better than anyone." The widow's breath caught painfully. Slowly, carefully. She unlocked the door. The man standing outside lowered his hat against the rain. Water streamed from the familiar brown overcoat with its velvet collar worn smooth by age. But the face beneath the brim did not belong to Harold Whitmore. It belonged to Alfred Bell's missing nephew, Jonathan Bell. Eleanor staggered backward slightly. You? Jonathan removed his gloves calmly before stepping inside. Though perhaps 45 now, he retained traces of the handsome young man villagers once remembered before his sudden disappearance years earlier. Yet bitterness had carved itself deeply into his expression. You've aged, Mrs. Whitmore. So have you. He glanced toward the fire. I apologize for the theatrics, but fear is often useful. You frightened the entire village deliberately. Yes. Why? Jonathan Bell smiled faintly. Because frightened people make mistakes. Across the square, Beatrice Marlowe sat awake in her rented room reviewing details from Lydia Mercer's murder. Something continued troubling her profoundly. Not the strangulation, not the burned evidence, not even the repeated appearance of 11:11 upon stopped clocks. It was Hollow Manor itself. Why meet there? Why search old records in an abandoned house instead of privately elsewhere? Unless Lydia Mercer expected to find something hidden within the manor already. Beatrice rose suddenly. Of course. The caretaker mentioned shipping records. Without hesitation she grabbed her coat and lantern before hurrying into the storm toward Hollow Manor once again. Meanwhile, inside Ashcombe Cottage, Jonathan Bell removed a folded photograph from his coat pocket and placed it carefully upon the table beside Eleanor. 3 young men beside a fishing boat, Harold Whitmore, Thomas Mercer, Alfred Bell. The same damaged photograph from the workshop wall, except this version remained untouched. No scratched face, Eleanor whispered. Jonathan nodded. My uncle destroyed the other one himself. Why? Because Thomas Mercer learned the truth. The widow stared upward sharply. You know what happened? I know everything. Rain battered the windows harder. Jonathan Bell settled into the armchair opposite Eleanor as though finally exhausted from years of silence. My uncle wasn't innocent, he admitted quietly, but neither was Harold. No. The word escaped Eleanor instinctively. Jonathan's expression hardened. You still protect him even now. He was my husband. He was a thief. Silence struck the room heavily. Eleanor looked away first. Jonathan continued. The merchant ship carried diamonds, yes, but also documents proving several powerful men funded illegal smuggling operations through Cornwall during the war. He leaned forward. Harold Whitmore intended selling those documents. The widow's face drained completely of colour. No. Yes. Jonathan's voice sharpened. Thomas Mercer discovered the plan accidentally after the wreck. My uncle wanted the papers destroyed. Harold wanted profit. And Thomas? He threatened exposing both of them. Eleanor closed trembling eyes. So they killed him? Jonathan hesitated. No. Her eyes opened again immediately. What do you mean? My uncle did not murder Thomas Mercer. Then who did? Before Jonathan could answer, loud pounding erupted suddenly against the cottage door. Constable Hobbs' voice shouted through the storm. Mrs. Whitmore! Miss Marlowe sent me. Jonathan stood instantly. Too late. The constable entered moments later, dripping rainwater and carrying visible alarm. Then he saw Jonathan Bell. For several seconds nobody moved. You, whispered Hobb. Jonathan gave a tired smile. Good evening, constable. You're supposed to be dead. So is Harold Whitmore. Across the moor, Beatrice entered Hollow Manor through the rear servants' entrance where rain leaked steadily through cracked ceilings. Her lantern cast long, trembling shadows across dust-covered walls, while wind moaned somewhere deep inside the empty corridors. The manor felt different tonight. Not abandoned, watched. She crossed carefully toward the old records library Lydia Mercer had searched before her death. Shelves towered overhead, filled with mould-stained account books and shipping ledgers. Beatrice moved her lantern slowly across the room, then stopped. One shelf stood partly open. Hidden behind it lay a narrow passage. Interesting. Very interesting indeed. The concealed passage descended steeply beneath the manor toward underground storage chambers once used during wartime. Damp air smelled strongly of salt water and old wood, and somewhere below, footsteps echoed faintly. Not hers. Beatrice extinguished the lantern immediately. Darkness swallowed everything. Another sound followed. Metal scraping stone, someone searching. Carefully, silently. Beatrice moved deeper underground, guided only by faint candlelight ahead. The hidden chamber finally appeared beyond the passage. Crates lined the walls, smuggling crates, many still bearing faded shipping symbols from 20 years earlier. At the centre of the room stood a man holding a lantern beside an open chest glittering brilliantly with diamonds, the mysterious figure in the brown overcoat. At last. Beatrice stepped forward quietly. "You've been difficult to find." The man turned sharply. Older face. Scar across one cheek. Sharp grey eyes widened in shock. Not Harold Whitmore. Not Jonathan Bell. Beatrice recognised him instantly from the old photograph. Thomas Mercer. Alive! For several seconds neither spoke. Then Thomas Mercer laughed softly. "I wondered who would solve it first," he said. Above them, thunder shook Hollow Manor violently while hidden diamonds sparkled like frozen fire beneath the lantern glow, and in Blackthorn Hollow the dead had finally begun returning home. Chapter 8. The Secret. Hidden in lace. For several stunned moments, Beatrice Marlowe simply stared at the man standing before her in the underground chamber beneath Hollow Manor. Thomas Mercer. Alive. Older now, certainly. His dark hair had silvered at the temples and a jagged scar crossed one weathered cheek. Yet the face matched the photograph perfectly. The dead schoolmaster's son had survived 22 years inside shadows. "You're supposed to be buried," Beatrice said quietly. Thomas Mercer gave a tired smile. So was Harold Whitmore. The lantern light flickered across crates of hidden diamonds surrounding them. Dust drifted lazily through the underground air while storm winds groaned somewhere above the manor ceiling. Beatrice kept her voice calm. "You murdered Alfred Bell. No? You expect me to believe otherwise? I expect nothing any more." Thomas closed the chest carefully before leaning against it with visible exhaustion. "I did not kill Alfred," he repeated, "though perhaps I wished to once." "Then who did?" Instead of answering directly, Thomas studied Beatrice thoughtfully. "You're cleverer than the others. Tell me, Miss Marlowe, what is the one detail that never fits?" Beatrice remained silent, because she already knew. "The clocks," she said. Thomas nodded slowly. "Exactly." Every stopped clock showed 11:11, too deliberate, too theatrical. "Alfred Bell repaired clocks his entire life," Beatrice continued softly. "If he were attacked unexpectedly, a clock stopping naturally at that exact time would be coincidence. But every staged clue points there intentionally." "Go on." "Someone wanted the village obsessed with 11 minutes past midnight." Thomas smiled faintly. "And why?" Beatrice's thoughts raced rapidly now. Mrs. Whitmore claimed seeing a shadow leave the workshop at 11:11. The church bell rang incorrectly at that same moment. The clocks froze deliberately there afterward. A performance. A constructed memory. "Because the real murder occurred earlier," Beatrice whispered. Thomas Mercer's expression confirmed it instantly. "Very interesting indeed." "You understand faster than Harold ever did," he murmured. Beatrice stepped closer carefully. "Tell me the truth about that night." For several seconds Thomas said nothing. Then, slowly, he removed gloves from trembling hands. "My death beneath the train was arranged," he admitted. "Alfred Bell helped me disappear after I discovered the smuggling network behind the wrecked ship." "You trusted him?" "At first," Thomas laughed bitterly. "We were fools once. Harold, Alfred and I believed finding the diamonds would make us wealthy beyond imagination. But the papers changed everything." "Yes," his voice darkened. "The cargo included documents naming powerful men involved in wartime smuggling operations. Politicians, customs officials, wealthy businessmen." He looked toward the diamonds. The jewels mattered less than the names. "And Harold intended blackmail." Thomas nodded once. "Alfred wanted silence. Harold wanted profit. I wanted none of it." "So you vanished?" "I tried." Thunder cracked violently overhead. Beatrice folded her arms thoughtfully. "Then why return now?" Thomas Mercer's face changed completely. "Because Alfred Bell finally contacted me." Silence filled the chamber. "He found you?" "Yes." Thomas reached into his coat slowly. 3 weeks ago, a letter arrived in Scotland. He handed it carefully to Beatrice. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Alfred Bell. It said only, I cannot carry the guilt further. Come before midnight on October 19th. The night he died, whispered Beatrice. Thomas nodded. I came secretly to Blackthorn Hollow intending finally ending the matter forever. But someone killed Bell first. Yes. Beatrice's mind moved rapidly through every detail again. Not Jonathan Bell, not Thomas Mercer. Then who remained? Suddenly another truth struck her sharply. The lace curtains, she whispered. Thomas looked confused, but Beatrice understood now. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore watched the village every evening not from fear, from duty, because she had been waiting for someone, or watching someone. Without another word, Beatrice turned immediately toward the passage stairs. I must speak to Mrs. Whitmore. Thomas caught her arm gently. Be careful. Why? His tired eyes met hers steadily. Because Eleanor Whitmore knows who murdered Alfred Bell. Rain had weakened into mist by the time Beatrice hurried back toward Blackthorn Hollow. Midnight approached quickly now. The village square lay silent beneath weak moonlight, while curtains remained tightly closed against the cold. Only one window glowed faintly. Ashcombe Cottage. Inside, Constable Hobb sat rigidly near the fireplace while Jonathan Bell paced restlessly across the room. Eleanor Whitmore remained motionless beside the famous lace curtains, staring into darkness outside. The moment Beatrice entered, all three looked toward her. You found him, Eleanor said softly. Not a question. Yes. Constable Hobb rose immediately. Thomas Mercer's alive? He is. Jonathan Bell swore quietly beneath his breath, but Beatrice focused only on Eleanor. You knew? The widow lowered her eyes. I suspected. No, said Beatrice firmly. You knew from the beginning. A long silence followed. Finally Eleanor Whitmore nodded faintly. Yes. Constable Hobb stared in disbelief. For heaven's sake, why hide it? Because Thomas Mercer was never the danger, Eleanor whispered. Jonathan stopped pacing instantly. What does that mean? Beatrice stepped slowly toward the old widow. The person Mrs. C. Whitmore feared was never Thomas Mercer. Her voice softened. It was Harold. Nobody spoke. Even the fire seemed to quiet. Eleanor's pale hands trembled violently now. I loved my husband, she said weakly. But loving someone does not blind you forever. Beatrice knelt beside her chair gently. Tell us what happened after the shipwreck. Tears finally filled the widow's eyes. Harold survived the storm and returned home carrying the documents. Her voice cracked painfully. He intended selling them to protect himself. Jonathan Bell stared at her. My uncle told him not to. Yes, Eleanor nodded. Alfred wanted the papers destroyed before more people died. And Thomas? He threatened exposing them both? Constable Hobb swallowed hard. So Harold killed Mercer? No, whispered Eleanor. Another silence. Then Beatrice asked the final question quietly. Who killed Harold Whitmore? The widow's breathing became uneven. Outside, church bells began striking midnight slowly across Blackthorn Hollow. 1, 2, 3. At last, Eleanor Whitmore looked upward through tears shimmering in the firelight. I did. Chapter 9. A candle. Before dawn. The confession settled into the room like something heavy that refused to lift. For several seconds no one moved. Only the fire cracked softly in Ashcombe Cottage, while midnight bells faded across Blackthorn Hollow, leaving the village suspended in uneasy silence. Beatrice Marlowe remained kneeling beside Eleanor Whitmore, her expression steady but deeply focused. You killed your husband, she said quietly, not with judgment but with understanding that made it worse. Eleanor did not deny it. I did, she repeated, barely audible, not in hatred, in necessity. Constable Hobb took a step back as if the words physically struck him. Jonathan Bell's face tightened. You're admitting murder? Eleanor's eyes lifted slowly. I am admitting the truth, Beatrice rose gently. Then tell us everything, from the beginning. The widow's hands trembled against her blanket, but her voice steadied as she finally released what she had carried for 20 years. Harold came home after the wreck a different man, she began. He was no longer afraid of the sea or the storm, he was afraid of people. Because of the documents? Beatrice asked. Yes, names, routes, payments, proof of an entire system. Not just smuggling, but protection from authorities, men who should never have been involved. Constable Hobb muttered. And Bell? Eleanor nodded faintly. Alfred Bell wanted to sell the diamonds quietly to erase everything. He said truth would destroy more lives than silence. Jonathan Bell gave a bitter laugh. My uncle always believed silence was mercy. But Harold disagreed, Beatrice said. Yes. Eleanor's eyes darkened. He wanted justice, or revenge. I never knew which. Outside, wind scraped against the cottage walls like fingernails. The fire flickered lower. And Thomas Mercer, Beatrice continued. He discovered the truth when Harold showed him part of the papers, Eleanor whispered. He tried stopping everything. That's when things turned dangerous. Constable Hobb frowned. But Mercer is alive. Yes, said Beatrice softly. He faked his death beneath the train. Eleanor nodded slowly. Harold believed he was dead. Ah, that belief changed everything. Silence deepened again. Eleanor's voice dropped further. The night Harold returned after the storm, he told me Bell intended destroying him. He said Thomas was already gone, and Alfred would follow. He said I had to trust him no matter what happened. Her fingers clenched tightly. But I had seen what fear did to him. He was no longer thinking clearly. Beatrice watched her carefully. What did you do? Eleanor's eyes filled again. I followed him that night. The room tightened. Jonathan whispered, You went after him? Yes, her voice cracked. He went to meet Alfred Bell at the workshop. I waited outside in the rain. I heard shouting, glass breaking, then silence. Constable Hobb swallowed. And then? I entered. Beatrice's voice was very quiet now. What did you see? Eleanor's breath shuddered. Harold standing over Alfred Bell. Bell was already dead. The fire snapped sharply. Eleanor continued. Harold told me it was necessary. He said Alfred had betrayed everything, that Thomas was alive, that the documents were gone. She closed her eyes. But I knew him. I knew what he'd become. Constable Hobb asked hoarsely, So you killed him there? Eleanor shook her head once. No. Beatrice's gaze sharpened. Then how did he die? The widow opened her eyes slowly. I poisoned him before he left the house. A stunned silence followed. Even Jonathan Bell looked shaken now. Eleanor whispered, Not to punish him, to stop him. Stop him from what? Beatrice asked immediately. From meeting the others again. The words hung in the air. Constable Hobb finally spoke. You mean Harold intended killing Bell and Mercer both? Eleanor nodded faintly. Yes. Beatrice stepped closer. And the grave? Eleanor's voice broke completely. I did not bury him. Jonathan frowned sharply. What? I left him at the cliffs, she said. The storm washed everything away. I believed the sea would keep the truth hidden forever. Constable Hobb stared in disbelief. So there was no grave at all? Eleanor shook her head. Only fear and time. A long silence followed. Then Beatrice finally spoke. Someone else has been moving the story forward. Eleanor looked confused. What do you mean? Beatrice turned toward the window. Jonathan Bell did not come here for revenge. Thomas Mercer did not come here only for diamonds. Her eyes narrowed slightly. This entire sequence has been guided. Constable Hobb frowned. Guided by whom? Beatrice did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked toward the lace curtains. Outside, Blackthorn Hollow lay still beneath pale moonlight. Too still. Then she said softly, By someone who understood every secret in this village. Jonathan stepped forward. You think there's another person involved? Beatrice turned slowly. Yes. Eleanor whispered. No one else knows. Beatrice looked at her carefully. That is what you believe. A sudden knock struck the door. All four froze instantly. Another knock followed. Slow, deliberate. Constable Hobb reached for his baton instinctively. Jonathan moved slightly back. Eleanor's face went pale again. Beatrice walked toward the door. Who is it? She called. A familiar voice answered calmly through the wood. Someone who has been watching through lace curtains for 20 years. Eleanor gasped sharply. Beatrice's hand paused on the latch. The voice continued softly. And now it is time to stop watching. Outside, dawn had not yet arrived, but something far more important was about to step into the light. Chapter 10. Curtains. Finally opened. For a moment after the voice outside the door spoke, Ashcombe Cottage felt as if it had stopped existing in time. No wind, no fire crackle, No breath. Only silence so complete it felt artificial. Eleanor Whitmore stood frozen, one hand pressed to her mouth. Constable Hobb tightened his grip on his baton. Jonathan Bell's eyes narrowed sharply, and Beatrice Marlowe remained closest to the door, her expression steady but fully alert. Ah, someone who has been watching through lace curtains for 20 years. The voice was calm, unhurried, certain. Beatrice spoke softly without turning back. "You are not Harold Whitmore." A pause followed. Then the voice answered, "No, Harold Whitmore was never the centre of this story." Eleanor whispered, "Open the door." Beatrice hesitated only a second before unlocking it. The door creaked open slowly, and standing beneath the pale pre-dawn sky was Thomas Mercer. Not the exhausted man from Hollow Manor, not the fugitive hiding in shadows, but someone different, collected, clean, controlled. Behind him, mist drifted across the village square like drifting lace. Eleanor stumbled backward. "You—" Thomas Mercer stepped inside calmly. "I told you I was alive," he said gently. "I just didn't tell you everything." Constable Hobbs' voice broke. "Another lie?" Thomas shook his head. "No, a correction." Beatrice studied him carefully. "You orchestrated everything." Thomas met her gaze. Not everything, but enough to ensure the truth finally surfaced. Jonathan Bell took a step forward, furious now. "You murdered Alfred Bell." Thomas's expression darkened slightly. "No," he said again. "Alfred Bell killed himself the moment he decided to protect the diamonds instead of the truth." Eleanor whispered, "Stop." But Thomas continued. "Alfred discovered what really happened on the cliffs. Not just smuggling, not just betrayal. A staged wreck designed to erase political debts. Harold Whitmore realized it too late." Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "And you?" Thomas exhaled slowly. "I survived because I chose to disappear." Constable Hobb frowned. "You faked your death." "Yes. And Lydia Mercer," a flicker crossed Thomas's face. "She came too close." Silence fell heavily again. Eleanor's voice shook. "You said you weren't the danger." Thomas turned to her. "I wasn't. I am the consequence." Beatrice stepped slightly forward. "You used the village." Thomas did not deny it. "I used the truth hidden inside it." Outside, the sky finally began to pale. Dawn was approaching. Beatrice spoke carefully. "You manipulated Eleanor's fears, the clocks, the grave, the letters, even the widow's curtains." Thomas's gaze shifted toward Eleanor. "She watched everything for 20 years. She already knew something was wrong. I only guided what she already suspected," Eleanor whispered, broken. "Why?" Thomas's voice softened slightly. "Because silence protects the guilty." Jonathan laughed bitterly. And what are you? Justice?" Thomas looked at him calmly. "No, I'm what remains after justice is delayed too long." Beatrice turned toward Eleanor. "You did not kill Harold Whitmore alone, did you?" Eleanor shook her head weakly. "No. I only gave him what he already chose. Poison. He left afterward. I thought he would die at sea." Thomas nodded. "He did." Constable Hobb frowned, but there was no body. Thomas finally smiled faintly. "Because I removed it." The room went completely still. Eleanor stared at him. "You buried him?" "In the only place no one would look," Thomas said quietly. "The sea remembers nothing and everything at once." Beatrice's mind connected the final pieces rapidly. "Then the empty grave was never real," Thomas nodded. "It was staged later, to push the truth forward. Fear makes people confess. Confession makes stories collapse." Jonathan's voice trembled with anger. "You killed Lydia." Thomas's expression hardened. "I did not enjoy it. But she would have exposed names that would have caused another war of silence." Beatrice stepped closer now, voice steady but sharp. "And Alfred Bell?" Thomas finally looked away. "He was never supposed to die, but he panicked. He tried to destroy everything when he realized I was alive." Eleanor whispered faintly. "And the lace curtains?" Thomas looked at her again. "You watched because I asked you to," her breath caught. "What?" "I needed eyes in the village," he said quietly. "Someone who could see patterns others missed. You were perfect for that role." Eleanor staggered slightly. "So I was part of your design," Thomas's voice softened. "You were the only honest witness left," Beatrice stepped between them slightly. And now, Thomas looked toward the window. Now it ends. Dawnlight finally touched the horizon outside Blackthorn Hollow, spilling faint gold across the square. For the first time, everything was visible. No shadows, no hiding, only truth. Beatrice spoke quietly. Not all of it ends. Thomas looked at her. Doesn't it? Beatrice shook her head. You still arranged deaths. You still controlled lives. Truth does not erase consequence. Silence followed. Constable Hobb finally said, I should arrest you. Thomas did not resist. He simply nodded. I expected that. Jonathan watched in disbelief. And the diamonds? Thomas turned slightly. Let them remain where they are. Eleanor closed her eyes. At last she whispered, I just wanted it to stop. Beatrice gently placed a hand on her shoulder. It has. Outside, villagers began waking to a village that would never feel the same again. Thomas Mercer was led away quietly as dawn fully broke over Blackthorn Hollow. No resistance, no escape, only resolution. Later that morning, Beatrice stood alone by the village square watching sunlight finally replace shadow. Curtains across every house slowly opened, except one, Ashcombe Cottage, where Eleanor Whitmore remained behind her lace curtains one final time, not watching any more, just resting. Beatrice understood then that some mysteries were not solved by uncovering truth alone, but by finally allowing it to breathe. And as Blackthorn Hollow returned slowly to life, the widow's curtains moved gently in the morning wind for the last time. Thanks for joining this mystery journey. If you enjoyed it, please like, share and subscribe for more classic detective stories and timeless village secrets next time.